Okay, so let's begin. We spoke a little bit before this call began, Binoy, but the first question that I want to ask you is there was a controversy in the second college that you went to after Gokhale Institute about
Yeah.
the demolishing of a particular canteen designed by an architect who either used to work there or teach there. I'm not sure.
Uh,
Whatever your opinion about that canteen, the question that I wanted to ask you is how important is it to you as a student of urbanization to preserve the character of a city as it evolves over
yeah.
time? How important is
Yeah.
the facade? How important is the look and feel of a particular city?
Yeah. Okay. So just for a bit of background, immediately after my master's in economics at Gokhale, I worked for a bit and then I did another master's in urban planning from CEPT University in Ahmedabad. So that's one of the two premier institutes for urban planning in India. And that's actually how I transitioned from a career in economics into a career in planning. Now, CEPT University, as Ashish mentioned, the real I wouldn't even call him. So he's probably the founder, and he's kind of like the real means to why CEP University came about. So in many ways, he is the formulator of CEP University. That is the architect by B.V. Doshi. He's one of the most celebrated architects in India, and he's actually the architect behind the CEP University building. Um, and one of those buildings in the university was brought down recently, and I think that was what led to the controversy. So I wouldn't get into that controversy too much, but what Ashish's larger question around uh, preserving the building construct. See, this in many ways, these buildings are like the stamps of our history, right? I mean, it's the connections to our history. A lot of things change over time, but when we have the original buildings and the original and see them for their original intent, they give us an idea of how they functioned in that time, and that, in a sense, is our tie into history. So from a planning perspective, they become very important to maintain. Of course, you have to be practical. There's not everything that is maintainable, but the good thing about it is that most iconic buildings were built to last for many years, and in that sense, the only reason why they need to be destroyed is if you don't value them in any way. It's not because the buildings have themselves become decrepit over time. So in that sense, I think it's very important that we maintain these buildings and because of their tie-in with our history.
So the reason I asked this question is because the Sunday Times of India just a couple of days ago published an article about the importance or the need to preserve the cultural ethos through preserving buildings. And
Yeah.
uh, either you or especially Neha might be surprised or saddened to hear this, but Errol D'Souza, the director of IIM Ahmedabad, proposed that the Louis Kahn design structure be brought down because, according to
Oh,
him, it doesn't look, I'm
see,
paraphrasing over here, but look good enough for the 21st century. I don't necessarily
oh,
agree with that.
I strongly disagree with that. I think that is an extremely beautiful building. But the thing is, with architecture, like all forms of art, it is subjective, right? But the historic behind that cannot be denied. The fact that this is part of the historical character of Ahmedabad city. Now, these buildings have been around for about 40, 50 odd years. I think from that perspective is good enough that they as to why they should continue and continue to be maintained. I mean, we can all debate about certain buildings. We may like them, we may not like them, but for whatever reason, I think there should be a very strong reason for you to pull down some structure. And I don't think the fact that they don't fit into the 21st century, the 21st century in many ways is still finding its feet about its architectural style, right? I mean, we are still very young into this century. So to say that something doesn't meet 21st century standards, I don't know what that actually means.
To be fair
Yeah,
to Errol D'Souza, I'm quoting from memory, so I may have got the specific quote wrong. But like you, I was
yeah,
very saddened to hear that the building may not be around. And that's why I wanted that to be the first question.
yeah,
Okay, second, based on what I know of your approach towards urbanization, I think it would be a fair characterization to say that you prefer walkable cities over vehicular cities.
yeah. But
Cities
it's not.
should prioritize
Yeah, but actually,
walking.
it's not just me. It's almost everybody,
Yeah,
right? Because it's only when we put the tag of walkable versus motorable city then that people start like getting preconceived ideas as to what is desirable. But when you think
mhm.
about the cities that you I mean, look around the world. I mean, the cities that you that are considered the wonderful, beautiful cities that people want to visit or people want to live in. You name them, like whether it's Paris, London, Singapore, or even closer home to India, where they're talking about Delhi, Mumbai. The thing that really ties in these cities are the fact that these are cities you can walk through, right? These are cities that you can experience as a pedestrian.
Mhm.
So this is not coming from a perspective, and very often we see these things as competing, uh, and in some ways they are. You can't sacrifice motorability without. I mean, you can't improve walkability without sacrificing some amount of motorability for your cities. But it's in other ways, it's also about balance. It's about getting that right kind of balance. And there are extremely good examples of cities like London, New York, etc., which are quite motorable. They have their issues, no doubt, but at the same time, they are extremely walkable cities. And I think that's the kind of balance that we need to strive for. It doesn't necessarily have to be a zero-sum game all the time. And that's, I think, what is important to consider.
Why are walkable cities better than motorable cities? I mean, you can speak about the relative importance of each, but what makes them stand apart according to you?
So I think for one is, I mean, we can go into a lot of different reasons, but I think the foremost reason of why uh, you would say a walkable city is a better goal than a motorable city is because you look at what you aspire in a city is you aspire close densities, you aspire people living in a denser area, and the moment you try to achieve that kind of density, and you also say that I want to put in the best of infrastructure to make it a motorable city, these two things conflict with each other, because then what you need is you need to have wide avenues, you need to have intersections that are very far apart, you need to have streets that are without intersections, and then what you end up with is something like Gurgaon is today,
Hmm.
where in the heart of what is considered the main Gurgaon area, nothing is walkable, right? It's a good city to drive through, and it's exactly that. These are what you would call flyby cities, right? You want to drive as fast through them, but you don't want to really immerse yourself in these cities, and that's the problem. Is that these two things are in conflict. If you want to build a city that is extremely attractive, then you have to sacrifice some amount of motorability in them.
What is it that we as a country, as a society, as a culture, miss or underrate about urbanization? So, whether it is Gandhi before independence romanticizing the villages, whether it is successive governments since independence speaking about the importance of villages,
Yeah.
what is it about us that explains our almost aversion, as it were, to urbanization?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't go back as far as Gandhi because I think his pragmatism of sort of protecting villages actually fits very well with how we look at cities today. It's about uh, sustaining the current ways of cities. So his pushing forward a rural agenda was not, it shouldn't be read as necessarily an attack on cities.
Okay.
What I would really like to critique is actually how we've approached urbanization in the last 40 years or so. And I think that is something that is probably more relevant. Is unfortunately, our Indian planners who have been the kind of forebearers of this our urban approach are still enamored and still sort of drawn towards the automobile oriented approach of European and American cities back in the 1960s. So we're still chasing the dream that they set for themselves back in 1960s or so, and they themselves have moved away from that dream,
Hmm.
right? So you're seeing today in Europe, in North America, the cities are tearing down freeways, they're tearing down road ramps, they're pulling out flyovers, and they're replacing that with pedestrianized boulevards, with walkways, with public spaces, etc. You see cities like London that have introduced congestion pricing, and it's not a new concept anymore. They've had this now for more than a decade, where they're trying to prevent cars from coming into downtown. You have extremely high prices for parking in the main central business district areas of these cities. We're seeing all of these happening in the countries and in the cities that we want to emulate, but we're emulating them of 40 years ago. So why are we doing that? Why can't we learn from the mistakes that they made and they've accepted that they made and that they are trying to correct now? We don't aren't yet in the problem stage that they are right now. We can actually address these issues before we get there. Unfortunately, and I will take one example being the Mumbai coastal road. For those of you who don't know this, this is the 20 odd kilometer coastal road that is being planned along Mumbai, along the entire western coast of Mumbai. Now, the western coast of Mumbai is the coast which has Marine Drive, Bandstand, Carter Road, Worli, Sea Face, and all these lovely public spaces where the average Mumbaiker goes to experience the sea. And if you've seen the Hazar and One Bollywood movies where the hero will go sit on the rocks and look at the sea and dream about his lover and look at the sunset, right? Now, what they are planning to do is put a huge road right in front of that, and not just in front of that, but actually a big wall in front of that road so you cannot see the sea beyond that. And what they're planning is a few little promenade public spaces that go beyond the stretch, but to access them, you'll need a car because they will not be walkable spaces. There'll be spaces that you take your car, park somewhere, then cross under the bridge and go into those little public spaces. And I can get into length as why those don't work. But anyways, this expressway that they are planning to build, the primary focus of that is to connect the central business district of South Mumbai to the suburbs in the north. And what that's going to effectively do, even if it is successful, and many people are actually questioning those numbers that they are quoting, that they will be able to attract. But even if they are able to attract that, all that it's going to do is create more traffic congestion in the central business district of Mumbai. It's going to get in more cars, and we have to see that there are so many more practical, environmentally friendly ways of meeting the same targets and achieving the same results that are not being considered. And that is actually, I think, the problem with the way we are approaching urbanization. I've just given you one classic example that comes to mind because I am from the city of Mumbai, or rather I was from the city of Mumbai. But there are examples that you're seeing all across India. You're seeing that with the Yamuna Expressway that was built, the Delhi-Noida highway that was also built. There are so many of these examples that are there across India, which is very disheartening to see.
Fair enough. Since you brought up the topic, when it comes to Mumbai, I have yet to meet a Punekar who doesn't hate the city, and I've yet to meet a Mumbaiker who, in some way or the other, doesn't try to look down upon Pune. But between the two cities, and you've spent a fairly large amount of time in both, which do you think gets urbanization right and why?
So they both have their quirks and they obviously both have their advantages. I think one thing that Mumbai did very well in the last 10 years has sort of not been as good, but I think at least till 2010, what Mumbai did very well is public transit. I mean, it was easily the most exhaustive public transit system in the country by far. And even in terms of mode share, more people use public transit in Mumbai than any other city in India. This is even the height of what Delhi Metro is today. It still doesn't carry even a fraction of what the Mumbai Suburban Railways does. And Mumbai Suburban Railways, okay, keep that aside. Even if you take the BEST bus services, that carries more people than most metro services across India as well. So Mumbai does public transit very well. I think that is one thing that is definitely in its favor. Where I feel Pune has probably got it right of late is that at least in the kind of the urban expansion that are happening around Pune, I see some sense of mixed land use that is at least being promoted in those developments. You see these, I mean, the residential colony, and just outside that there will be for your daily needs grocery store and a few restaurants, and there is some attempt towards that. I feel Mumbai's approach has still been a lot more controlled, where we're still looking at land use as these big swaths of land where we want big chunks of residential and big chunks of commercial, and that sense. It's not as bad as Delhi, mind you, but I think there's still probably, if I have to compare, I think that's something that Pune has done a little better than Mumbai.
At least where Mumbai is concerned, I completely agree. I spent of my college years in Mumbai, and when it comes to transport and the ease with which you can move across what is in effect a very large city, I agree with you. It's probably unparalleled. But that leads me to a follow-up question. Why do we in India struggle with an integrated transport mobility plan? And I don't mean to sound very complicated. All I mean is, why can't I buy a single pass that allows me to use all transport systems within a city? So I can
Okay.
see it happen in other cities in the world. What stops us?
Yeah.
Is it hardware? Is it software? Or is it just bureaucracy?
It's bureaucracy. I mean, I think before moving to Canada, I worked with WRI India, and for my 10 years that I was there, for 10 years, this conversation has been happening with cities like Mumbai, Pune, Bangalore, and almost always the stumbling block. So technology is definitely not the stumbling block because we know the technology is there. Other countries and other cities have adopted it, and they've adopted it like 10 years ago. So, for instance, right now in Vancouver, I have a smart card, which is something like a credit card where I can load money on that, and I can travel on the bus, I can travel on the train, I can travel on the ferry that connects me to a neighboring city as well. So I pretty much can use it for every transit service in the city. And in some other countries, they've taken that one step further. You can even pay for your parking. You can even pay for some day-to-day groceries as well. There are
Right.
some incentives for that as well. So technology is definitely not the barrier anymore. What barriers exist are some are infrastructural because for instance, let's say if the suburban railways in Mumbai have to implement a system like that, we don't have the thing of like a passenger load entering from one particular point. So the entry points and the exit points need to be very controlled for a system like this to work.
Mm.
You can't have open points because the passenger has to swipe their card at some point and then swipe their card at another point to show that they have left the system, and that's how the fares are calculated. But those are infrastructural barriers that can be overcome. The bigger challenges is things like fair revenue sharing, right? Because if somebody starts their journey by bus and swipes at the point of entry in the bus and then swipes out much later when they take a train and another bus, then both these agencies have to decide a way of sharing
Right.
revenue.
Right.
And there are good models already established on how this can be done. So the only hurdle right now is the bureaucratic pressure for these people to say, okay, let's sit down and make this work. And yeah, with the willingness to share data, the willingness to trust each other, and be willing to share some infrastructure costs as well. And yeah, I think this should be done. I think Delhi Metro is making some attempts towards it. I know there are some other smaller cities that have introduced the smart card, but as yet, I don't think any of them cross transit systems as far as I know.
Mm.
But hopefully, we won't be having this conversation in another 5 years. I hope not, at least.
Okay. All right. So, speaking of transportation systems, and you touched upon this briefly earlier, walking is hugely underrated according to you in Indian cities, and for the most part, I agree. And one mea culpa, both of us wrote a couple of columns in the year 2018 about the widening of footpaths in Pune, especially Ferguson College Road. And now, having seen how the footpaths have worked out, I was completely wrong. Walking is a complete pleasure on that road. But the one gripe that I still have is the so-called smart roads or smart footpaths in Pune. We still don't, according to me, prioritize enough bus stops, number one. And number two, the ability to use buses in Pune is still just a complete utter disaster. There's no other way to put it.
Yeah.
Shouldn't both be happening in parallel?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree with you on this more. That of course we definitely have to do both parallelly. But one thing that would like to say is that doing more of or doing better bus transit doesn't necessarily need more physical space on the road.
Sure,
And
absolutely.
I know Pune is trying the BRT, and I have some strong opinions about that. But uh, what my point is that having better bus transit doesn't necessarily have to come at the expense of pedestrian infrastructure.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
And almost anywhere where there is a priority. And so we in this planning practice try to look at it as a pyramid of priority, right? And we put pedestrians right on the top, followed by transit. And of course, there are certain instances where you might want it to go the other way. But as a general principle, it's pedestrians, transit, paratransit, that is your taxis, rickshaws, and all of that coming in third, along with freight movement. And finally, at the bottom is private automobile users. So
Right.
that's, if you look at it from that perspective, I think you should, as a general rule, not compromise footpath and space for transit. And in most cases, you don't need to, because transit doesn't necessarily need more road space. It just needs more priority for the road space that is allocated to them.
Correct.
But on the other hand, pedestrian space comes at the expense of automobile space, and that is a choice that cities have to make if they really want to get good, vibrant cities.
Speaking of which, I actually didn't have this on my list of questions, but now that you spoke about this, I can't help but ask. So I probably think I got my question wrong. So absolutely, I agree with you. Better footpaths and broader footpaths, awesome. We need better public transport because with increasing urban density, you're going to have more vehicular traffic, and on narrow roads, that's a problem. But one thing that you kind of touched upon, and now that I think about it, probably the most important, why on earth do we not price parking better in India?
I mean, that's a big question that organizations like WRI and ITDP and a lot of people who are in this space have been raising. And there is no better answer than this is just down to pure politics of upper class people like us, right? We've been able to bully our way into this by stating facts. I mean, if you look at the numbers, just compare it for the numbers on absolute value, not even doing purchasing power parity, just on absolute value, Indian cities pay not even 1/10 of what cities outside India pay for parking in the downtown areas. I think so. You can park at last I checked, you can park your vehicle in downtown Mumbai for some 15 rupees an hour, and maybe in Bandra Kurla complex at the most for like 30 rupees an hour. That's the upper limit that it goes to. Okay, so I can tell you for a fact, like in cities like New York and all of them, it's a minimum of what would it work out to? Like 700 rupees an hour. I think it would work out to.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm hoping I'm getting the maths right. But yeah, approximately around that. That's what it would work out to for parking in the downtown area. The other anomaly that we have in India is on-street parking is actually cheaper than parking off-street. And that's fundamentally wrong, right? Because on-street parking is more convenient and you're creating more problems for people. You're using a more costly infrastructure. So on-street parking should be a lot costlier than off-street parking, but in India it's the other way around, right? It's costlier to park in those underground parking lots in the malls than it is to actually park on the street. The good way to understand this issue is imagine if that space had to be occupied tomorrow by a shop.
Exactly.
How much real estate, how much rent would that person have to pay for that space, right? And if you even charge a fraction of that for parking, it will be a lot more than what we currently charge for parking. And that's, I think, what is very important to say. This is like, and if the car user is not paying it, then indirectly we are all paying for it through a tax. So imagine if we actually charge those parking tariffs and that money is used to cross-subsidize public transit, which is what is done in many cities all over the world. Then you afford a lot better transit service, and at the same time you disincentivize people from using their car for a trip that they could essentially do with transit. So I think without doubt this should be the very first move that cities should make, is get parking pricing correct. There are lots of good theoretical articles that I can share about parking and parking pricing, and the most important thing to note here is that you don't need to have paid parking everywhere, right? And if parking actually follows the market principle, you would see that places which are out in the distant area where parking is not really a problem, actually charging for parking there is counterproductive, because the cost of collecting the parking fee sort of is higher than the revenue that you generate from that parking. So you only need to price it where it matters, and during the time periods that it matters. You don't need to price it in the night perhaps and stuff like that, but during peak hours you price it correctly by market principles. Generally not market principles, but they say the price it at the because again, since you're the economist students, I can tell you this thing, right? Because this is a classic case of fixed capacity, right? It's fixed capacity. So if you set a market price, and because of the problems of monopolistic competition, you're going to have underutilization of the resources. So you want to actually fix it at the price where it has a maximum utilization of those parking spots. And generally they say if you fix it at a price where around 85% of the spots get filled up, then it's a good thing, because then it still keeps a 15% open for the search to avoid the search cost of searching for a free parking space and all of that. So that's generally the accepted principle around parking pricing. And it's a great field for applied economics to actually understand how to price parking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we're roughly half an hour into our conversation. Hopefully, to everybody in the call, it's clear about how passionate you are about urbanization and associated topics. And I've either forgotten your answer or I've never asked you this question, which would be quite a surprise. But what made you take up urbanization as a field of study in the first place? What interested you after you did your economics
Okay.
to study
So it's a
urbanization?
good, good question. So I've always actually been interested in this field, and like a lot of us, when we are in the 10th standard and stuff, we just go with the flow. We don't really choose streams because we think, okay, future, I want to study this. It's just like at that particular point of time, this is something that I like. So at that point of time, I thought I liked economics, and I said, okay, let me go ahead and make this my thing. Somewhere along the line, I sort of got a little disillusioned with economics, or rather, I would say economists got a little disillusioned with me because I couldn't keep up. I mean, economics for me in undergrad was a lot about reading text and understanding the theories of Smith and Keynes and Marshalls, and I really liked that. But then fast forward to the master's program, and it became a lot about understanding the mathematics behind economics, and it became something that was, to me, a lot of it went over my head, and I sort of lost the passion for the subject as well, because I thought, like, okay, this is, I mean, it's gone beyond the theory of it to try and really force fit a model into something, and I know it works for a lot of people, but this was not something that I sort of really liked. At the same time, uh, I was drawn towards urban issues for the longest time. I did not know that I was eligible for a career in that at that point of time. I thought this was something that was only open to people who had done a civil engineering or an architectural degree. But when I looked up the course on CEPT University, and the person who's currently my wife at that point of time was actually the one who encouraged me. Her name is Neha. She's also a student at Gokri. She was Ashish's batchmate. She had actually looked it up, and she saw that I'm eligible for this degree if I had to clear the technical test that they had. And I studied a little bit for that test, and I cleared it. And yeah, I was one of two uh, non-architect, non-engineering students in that course. But it was great because I think the two of us were able to bring a slightly different dimension to the thinking, and we also learned a lot. I mean, I learned about architecture. I learned about people like B.V. Doshi and Khan and all of these great architects, and I learned to think like an architect. I mean, to appreciate space. I did not even know what that meant before. To appreciate angles and space and how space gets used and form and function and all of these terms, I began to recognize what they meant, and yeah, it was a great opportunity, which I'm quite happy about.
Speaking of learning, one thing that both Neha and I, and indeed everybody who knows you has teased you about is your almost addiction to YouTube. So jokes apart, how should we learn from you about how to use YouTube as a great way to learn? What are we missing in terms of YouTube usage?
No, I think it's not. So for urban planning per se, I think YouTube is good because urban planning is a very visual field, right? And I think having a video out there to demonstrate a lot of these things is fantastic. So I would obviously encourage other people to look at a lot of YouTube videos, and I can send you all later some of my favorite channels that I look at for feed on this.
Yes, please.
But I think more than just YouTube, it's the complete I would say democratization of education that has happened in the last 5 or 6 years. And Ashish can actually vouch for this. Is back in our time, you had to spend a lot of time in the library to learn a lot of stuff. Now today, you can go out there and say, "I'm an expert on Jane Jacobs." You could have never read a Jane Jacobs book in your life because you can read synthesis which are sort of contextualized to today's time. You can see videos about her views. You can get a lot of different perspectives on that topic, and you can still have a fairly good understanding of what she envisaged and what her ideas were without actually having read her books. So I think in that sense, I would say, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because now we are bombarded with so much of information, and we need to take in a lot more. So it's fine to it. I don't feel don't think anyone should feel like, oh, I'm not really an expert unless I actually go through the books. if of course certain books that you really like, you should definitely read them. But I think it's also, there's no harm in learning from the internet, and YouTube I think is fantastic. I think there's, as I said, it's a democratization of education, right? I think, yeah, from that perspective, it's good.
So it's weird, but I arguably, and I'm committing a bit of heresy as an academician, but I think certain things are better learned on YouTube than in the classroom.
For sure, for sure. And I said it's the advantage of having the visual means for a
Mm.
for a subject like urban planning. I think that is extremely important because it can tell you something at the same time, show you a map and show you why that's relevant.
From an urbanization viewpoint, what is it that we get right but Canada doesn't?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just talk about Vancouver because I've still
Right.
now not been too much of outside Vancouver. So I think so. I live in Vancouver, which is on the west coast of Canada, and it's very often voted among the top three to top five global cities to live in across the different indexes, along with Melbourne, Sydney, and all that. Vancouver is right up there. And I can vouch that it's a beautiful city and it gets a lot of things right, especially around transit, around walking infrastructure, density, mixed land use, all of that I think is perfect. So since Ashish's question is about one thing that they could potentially learn from Indian cities, uh, I think I'd say this, that the cause of its biggest success in some ways is also probably the cause of its one biggest limitation. And that is the fact that I think Vancouver is a little too regimented and a little too planned and a little too controlled. Why I'll say this is, see, right now I live on a university campus. I live in the University of British Columbia campus. And where I live, it's a beautiful space. I mean, the walking infrastructure is top notch. It's green. And the public spaces are absolutely phenomenal. But when I say the walking infrastructure is top notch, but for me to walk to somewhere is really far. And I mean that in a good way, is that I can walk to a beach and that's very close by. I can walk to a public space and that's extremely close by. I can walk to a tennis court. All of that is close by. But if I want to walk to a restaurant, that's not going to be very far. There are very few options. If I want to walk to a grocery store, there are very few options. The reason for that is because the land use here is extremely controlled. If someone wants to open up a shop or a restaurant, it requires you to go through a plethora of permissions before you can actually get to that stage. And even they don't let that happen because they have controlled the land to such a high degree, right? So you compare that with, say, something like a Bombay University, where there are 1,001 of these street vendors and these little things that mushroom up all across the place. So it gives a lot more options. So you would imagine that there are the equal number of students out here. Food is expensive, and you would definitely see there is an economic pull for something like this to happen, for these changes to happen. But unfortunately, because it is so regimented, these economic forces are not allowed to play. And Ashish will tell you that I'm a big fan of just letting the market do its thing to the largest extent possible. Of course, there is need for some controls, but that's what they probably don't do. And it has its trade-offs. I mean, obviously, you get a very clean and a very neat city, but at the same time, you get a very dull city in some respects. And many people who criticize Vancouver criticize it from that perspective. They say, yes, Vancouver is very beautiful, and yes, Vancouver works like a clock. But at the same time, it doesn't have any vibrancy in it. They say it's a little dull city as compared to a New York or a London. And that probably explains why Vancouver in the evenings is quite dead. It's like post once the sun sets, it's quite a dead city. There's not much happening because everything is so regimented and so controlled. And yeah, I think that is the one criticism that I have of Vancouver.
You actually made it to about 42 minutes without you having mentioned Barcelona once, which is a pleasant surprise. But that would be an example of a city that gets it just right, right?
I mean, so for one, I don't talk too much because I've never actually been to Barcelona. I mean, I've only heard how lovely it is, and I hope if I actually go there, I don't get disappointed. But yeah, the reason I talk about Barcelona often is it's for people like me. It's very often quoted as a city that got a lot of urban planning principles right at the, I won't say at the beginning because all these cities are extremely old, but at the early stages of modern planning, right? At the early stages, they realized, okay, we have a downtown area that was never built for the car. Let's keep it that way. And they've protected a lot of these spaces are pedestrianized. They've pushed out vehicles. They've got the right kind of blend. The other important thing of and Ashish and I did a podcast on this some time back, is where we compared Barcelona and Chandigarh, right? And both these cities, if you look at an aerial view of these two cities, they kind of look similar because they both have a rectangular grid of roads, where roads meet at right angles, and they create these big blocks that are rectangular, square shaped. Now, so if you look at an aerial view of both these two cities and you don't look at the scale, you'll think, okay, they are quite identical, but the scale is actually where they differ. The Chandigarh grid is something like 800 meters by 1.2 kilometers, whereas the Barcelona grid, I think, is around 250 by 250 meters. So what that effectively means is that you have an intersection every 250 meters in Barcelona. So at every 250 meters, you have an opportunity to cross the street. Whereas with Chandigarh, it's every 800 to 1.2 kilometers. So that means almost a 10 to 15-minute walk to cross a road. And that in itself makes a big difference on how walkable a city is. So although Chandigarh, just like Barcelona, and probably even better than Barcelona, has very nice wide sidewalks and these shaded avenues with trees growing on either side and all of that. But you'll see a lot more people walking on a Barcelona street because there is a lot more to walk to. There's a lot more things that you can access from walking, by walking. So infrastructure is only one part of the puzzle. The second thing that is equally important is about a walkable city is having things that are at walkable distance. And that is, I think, where Barcelona and a lot of other cities, Paris as well, gets it right. I think even in India, if you look at it, Mumbai, at least a lot of downtown Mumbai is walkable. A lot of things that are, you don't need to get into a vehicle, and it's actually faster to walk to a lot of places than it is to be in a vehicle. So yeah, I think that's a good learning from there.
Okay. There was an article recently in I forget which newspaper I read it in, that spoke about making free left turns always available for motorists. So when you're at a traffic junction, you should have the ability to turn left without waiting for a signal.
Yeah.
So I remember sending you that article, and there were two very interesting parts about it. One, do you think something like that will work in India? And second, could you speak to all of us a little bit about how the Canadians do it? That I didn't know it, and it was amazing to listen to.
Yeah. So one is by traffic engineering science, free lefts. Yeah, free lefts in the Indian context.
That long.
It takes a while to not get it. Yeah. So free lefts is the norm, right? And even I was actually shocked when I left India to realize that other countries do the free left. Now, free left is the norm in the urban setting. I'm not talking about in outside the urban setting in your highways, but within cities, free left is the norm. But that makes sense and is doable only with the necessary condition that motorists respect the law, that they have to stop when a pedestrian is crossing along with them, right? And that happens by default in Canada, in America, and in Europe, because one, I guess there's a lot better training at the time of getting your license, but there's also stronger enforcement. If you happen to break that rule of when a pedestrian is crossing, that's like automatic demerit points that can really cost you a lot of money. So I would say, yes, this can work in India only if you're willing to do the other thing of actually ensuring that the rule is followed, that cars give way for pedestrians. Why I say it's a good norm to have is because you free up the flow of the intersection a lot more, because the pedestrians, typically a signal phase lasts for about 40 seconds or so. Pedestrians will cross in the first 15 seconds or so. The remaining time, why do you want to hold back traffic, right? So it's probably good that they do the free left in that time, once they have waited for pedestrians to cross, and wait again if a pedestrian happens to come at that point of time. But the rest of the time, let them cross. That's perfectly good. But the second part of your question as to how they do it in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. So Vancouver, as I said, is I don't know if I said this, but it's a grid city, much like Barcelona and Chandigarh, where you have a continuous repetition of forearm intersections, one followed by each other. So you, uh, in the Indian context, when you have a forearm intersection, we typically have four phases of our signal cycle, right? So where each arm of the road will have all green, and then they can go left, straight, or right. Then followed, it goes in an anti-clockwise manner, and then it repeats after four. So that's a typical way we design signals in the Indian context. Now, Vancouver and a lot of cities in the developed world, they do it with just two signal phases, right? So you'll have one. So let's say if it's a north-south and an east-west road, you'll have one green phase where north and south move together, and then another green phase where east and west move together. So now your question will be, but what about the left turns?
Correct.
Yeah. So what about that? So they do it along with the traffic coming in the opposite direction, with the caveat that just like you yield for pedestrians, you have to yield for motorists when they're coming in front of you. So you always, motorists in the same lane have the right of way over you. So you wait till you find a gap, and then you cut across. Now, again, all of this will only work if we have proper motorist discipline, which has to be taken. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Do you implement schemes like these when you have bad traffic discipline, or do you wait for traffic discipline and then implement schemes like this? And I don't honestly know the right answer, but this is why these systems work in Vancouver. This is why intersections are a lot have a much higher capacity, because you immediately double the capacity there, right? You go from 4 cycles down to 2 cycles, and it makes for a lot greater throughput for your intersections. And I think that's an important lesson to do. One thing that I would say about without worrying about traffic discipline and all that, one general observation that I have, and I've always been struggling for an answer for this, is why are signal cycles in typical Indian cities so long?
Yeah.
They literally are like sometimes 3.5 to 4 minutes. The average length for a signal cycle in Vancouver and most Western cities is about 60 seconds, right? And we almost do it 2 to 3 times, sometimes even 5 times that amount. And that in itself leads to a lot of backlog of traffic, which I think is some area that we can definitely explore about improving.
So again, a question that I actually didn't have on the list. I just finished teaching the first year students principles of economics, and the second year students have done far more work in micro already, obviously. There's a lovely book called Games Indians Play by V. Raghunathan. And one of the games that we play, I know your fascination with game theory, so perhaps you'll be interested in hearing this, is he models traffic in India as a game theory problem and speaks about the prisoner's dilemma, that you're going to end up in cheating because you anticipate that the other guy is going to cheat. From a cultural viewpoint, not from a theoretic viewpoint, from a cultural viewpoint, what is it that makes us approach traffic as a prisoner's dilemma, but other countries quite obviously do not?
Yeah, I mean that comes across with anything, but it's not unique to traffic in India. It's to ask the question also, why do systems break down in India when they don't break down in other countries? And so I would put it down to a combination of factors, and I'm not an expert as to why this happens, because a lot of it goes beyond. It's definitely not planning factors. It's definitely to me it comes down to the thing about resources, and I think this is. I mean, to those of you who remember watching Dark Knight, and this is line where the Joker says, right, is that when systems come down to real bad situations, all of us deep down now, and I'm really paraphrasing here, but all around deep down inside, we are just barbarians, and we will react to the situation when it goes to really terrible. And this COVID situation has shown us that when neighbor turns against neighbor, because now we're suddenly dealing with a situation that seems so horrific. I've seen that even in Canada, where the best of times everyone is very polite with each other. Suddenly, when this pandemic came about, no one knows how to react, and we've gone back to our old savage selves. So I think, that's perhaps the reason why a lot of systems break down in India, is that there are so many people competing for so less resources, and if you don't push your way through, another person might come and push you through. And that's a classic prisoner dilemma problem, right? You anticipate that somebody else is going to do it, and that's why you yourself do the wrong thing. The reason why it probably doesn't happen so much in Canada is because there are more resources, and there is a lot of the social shaming that will happen if you do it. Whereas you know that in India there are so many people, and it's not really going to be that much of a problem if I break that rules. So I won't put it down to anything beyond that. I wish there was a an urban planning answer to that question, but unfortunately, I think it comes down to just more people fighting for lesser resources.
Fair enough. Okay, two very broad questions about just broad definitions of urbanization, really. So, the first is our definition of urbanization itself. I'm no expert, but based on what I've read, apparently was defined in the 1960s. We haven't bothered refining it since then, number one. And second, it would seem, and again, this is an amateur when it comes to urbanization, but second, it would seem that we are not really 33% urbanized, depending upon what definition we use. It can range
Absolutely.
from between 30 to 60%.
Absolutely, yeah. So in fact, right now I'm doing this study on the Delhi NCR region, and I can tell you that currently I think it shows about 40% of the NCR region is actually rural, but in many which ways, rural by the current definition of what is urban and what is
Right.
rural, but in many which ways they're practically urban. And I think if anything, now this post-pandemic world will show us that this urban-rural divide is something that will completely go in the developed world
Mhm.
and will slowly start moving away in India as well. Because now with the access of technology, the richer people will actually want to live in what is countryside, right? And if you see a lot of what is happening now in the developed world is this suburbia and countryside distinction has almost happened in the sense that a lot of new housing that is happening is far flung because you can connect with technology to your workplace. Now you have this remote working concept as well. So it's the need to have densities uh, to some extent will still be there. We will still have this because there are not all activities that can happen remotely,
Right.
but the volume of density and the size of density, I think, in many ways has reached its crescendo in the developed world and has already started to dissipate, and that will soon happen in India as well. So I would say yes, we need to change the way we define urbanization in the way they look at it as the number of people that are working non-agrarian jobs and all of that. That's their current way of defining it. I think it more boils down to how do we define settlements now, human settlements,
Mm.
not really bother about whether we classify them as urban and rural, but how do we classify them from an administrative perspective so that the right kind of infrastructure and resources can be given depending on the kind of region it is.
Okay. So, having said all of that, and based on your response, is it such a bad idea to set a target for an urbanization rate for the next 10 years or so?
So I don't know whether we have a target, whereas
I
we
don't think we
have
do, but should we?
trend. No, I don't think we should have a. So we know what urbanization is expected. So we're taking it as a given. It's not something that we want to happen, but we are following the trend and we say this is what is going to happen. Now, how do we plan for it? So I think this is a very interesting point because I feel there's a kind of something missing in the way we look at it as planners in India is that
Mhm.
we say that India will be predominantly urban by 2050 and all of these
Correct.
2040 is actually what the numbers are.
Yeah.
Now, there are only three possible things that could happen in this case. One is that our cities can become denser by either going higher and or more crowded. Or the second is that we can sprawl out. Or the third is that we can build new cities.
Right.
Right? There's only three mathematical possibilities that can potentially happen.
Yeah.
Now, most experts agree that most Indian cities are already at peak density. We have cities like Mumbai that are around 30,000 people per square kilometer, and they're much higher than most good city. I mean, I think Paris is one exception which has a fairly high density, and even that is around 15,000 people per square kilometer. But most other cities like Barcelona, Vancouver, and all around 5,000 or so people per square kilometer. So we can see our Indian cities are way higher.
Mm.
The second possibility we said is sprawl, but we already know cities like Delhi, NCR, and all they're like regions in themselves. And
Right.
we know we don't the whole problems associated with sprawl. So the only third possibility is new towns, whether they're new satellite towns or new self-sufficient towns. But this is what is going to be developed.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, I don't see that as part of the urban agenda in India. We are not thinking new towns. I mean, China is and did for a large extent, but still, right now, our thought process around new towns are all these technology hub or capital cities like Amravati and all these kind of ideas, but not real ideas about organic growth around smaller towns to become the new big towns. We're not thinking of it from that perspective, and that is something that I feel is needs to come to the discussion. We need to see how the current tier three towns become the new big cities of India. Like if you can imagine what Bangalore was in 1990s,
Right.
there are currently around maybe 50 or 60 such cities that are the Bangalores of 1990. How do we ensure that if they are to become the Bangalore of 2020, they don't result in the problems that Bangalore of 2020
Exactly.
is facing? And that is, I think, what our real missed opportunity is that we're not really looking at. We're not looking at where these tier three cities are growing and how do we direct that growth better.
So two related questions that students have asked in the chat window. Now is a good time to incorporate them. I'll keep on doing that if I think that the question fits in over here. Rather than take them at the end, I'll fit them into our conversation.
Sure.
Adya asks, and this is related to town planning being done better. What are your thoughts on Acrosanti, the city of the future? This is the town in Arizona that combines ecology and architecture. So, to the extent that you're familiar with it, what are your thoughts about it, and how much of it is adaptable in India?
Yeah, so I'm being very honest. I don't know any details about this particular city, but generally, I mean, these city of the future concepts. I don't know about this particular city, but I'll talk about like some of these things that are planned in India, like the Science City, Knowledge City, Pharma City, and all of these things. Most of the time, we see these as these greenfield projects. It's like almost like we'll go and put up like a factory out there, and it will grow. I mean, and it'll be fine on its own. But we have to recognize that cities are like organisms, that they are sustainable at different scales, and they require different kinds of care and attention at these different scales. You can't just go and set up a big city or a medium-sized city from scratch. You need it to let it grow from a smaller point and to grow bigger. So what I feel is how we do it is not necessarily go and build these greenfield cities, which is what China did, and you see a lot of YouTube videos of these ghost towns in China right now, where they build these huge cities with huge malls and huge building complexes and all that for nobody, because they built it at a scale that wasn't organic growth. It was huge big chunks put together at one time. And I think those generally I tend to be skeptical about. I don't know if the city that she's asked about is like that, but yeah, that's my basic thought about stuff like that.
It's not
Well, I
along.
see a lot of these questions about stuff that I've never heard about. Should India adopt the Hukou system? I have no idea.
Hukou system. So I'll explain
I
that.
think
Also,
students are
Adya's
more
question,
knowledgeable about this topic.
which is awesome, right? Which is perfect.
Yeah, I know.
So
Yeah.
Acrosanti, I myself don't know a lot about it, and I might be wrong about the state also, but I think it is a city that was developed or is being developed in Arizona, and the idea is to combine ecological principles with architectural principles to build a more sustainable town. And it's been around for a while, I think, about 30 years or maybe more than that. I don't know. But that's the background to Acrosanti. And Jay's question, in fact, I was about to ask you about both of his questions. The Hukou system is a system adopted in China. And again, this is me paraphrasing and speaking off the cuff, so the details are probably slightly different. But the idea is it's something like a PAN card in India or an Aadhaar card in India. But the idea is it is tied to your place of residence. So if you want to organize mass migrations, then you simply shift the Hukou, and in a sense, the Chinese citizen is forced to move there. So Shenzhen developed because overnight a large number of Chinese citizens had their Hukou re-registered in Shenzhen, and that's how Ghost Town became Shenzhen. So should India adopt the Hukou system?
Yeah, so, sorry, I did not know it was called that, and my answer is to that, and I'm sorry for being very blunt, but absolutely no. Yeah, because I'm a firm believer in free market principles, Adam Smith, and all of that thing, and nothing should be freer than the human spirit and the human body, right? We cannot tell people where they should live and shouldn't live, and for China, for all its economic might and its economic growth, has done that at the sacrifice of this essential right of a person to decide where he or she wants to live. I think if we create the right kind of incentives, people will follow. I forget which economist said that, right? Vote with their feet. I don't remember that. Tibu, right? So people will also migrate with their feet. If you create the right kind of infrastructure, the people will follow. For those of you who played SimCity online, you will know that, right? You create the right infrastructure, and you will get the people to come there. So that is not to say that the Chinese system didn't meet its objectives, but what have they sacrificed to meet those objectives? And I think for me, that's a bigger price to have paid.
Absolutely. So
The
whenever I
second
speak about,
question about,
sorry, whenever I
sorry,
speak
yeah.
about the Hukou system, I always say that Indians should be careful about wanting to be more like China, because the cost at which China has arrived at where it is probably not a fair price
Yeah.
to pay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and I no, I don't mean to paint it in a complete bad tone, because there are a lot of great things that we can learn from China. There's a lot of efficiency in the way they do things, which I think is really good to emulate, not just by Indians but all over the world. But on this one aspect, I think I would rather go with India's inefficiencies and freedoms than for the greater economic benefit.
I've just finished talking about opportunity cost, so this is a good way to
Yeah.
talk about it. Sorry, go ahead.
The second question is, how should India address land acquisition process? This is actually a very good question, and I think there are some good models to look at. I talked briefly about a model that Gujarat has actually done quite well on, called the town planning scheme. I basically, everybody could see this question, so I'll just repeat the question in case people have not seen it. It's, how should India address the land acquisition problem in urban areas? So there are multiple models that of acquiring land, from the basic simplistic model where the government just says, I'll take over your land and I'll pay you whatever I feel like, which is what the Chinese model is somewhat like. But a second, more collective model is what the Gujarat model has, which is the town planning scheme. And I'm calling it a Gujarat model because it's sort of gained momentum in Gujarat for the first time in India, but now that model has sort of spread to other parts of the country as well. So in that model, what you basically do is the aggregator, in most cases it's the government, will go to these farmers or to the landowners and say, okay, we will buy your huge chunks of land, but we will give you back that land, but not the entire 100% of your land. I will give you back, say, if you give me 100 acres, I will give you back 80 acres. I will keep 20 acres for myself. But generally it's around 40, 60. So what does the government do with the remaining 40 acres? They use part of that to build the infrastructure for that land, that is the roads, the streets, and the other utilities and services that are needed, as well as they keep some chunks of that land to make money to pay for this whole scheme. Now, in this way, there is incentive because the person who's given up their land is getting back some land. The second thing that they also do is they regularize the size, the plot dimensions. If you had a kind of a crazy shaped plot, they will give you nice rectangular plots that when you want to sell that plot to a builder, it becomes a lot easier to do. And even though the government has taken away, say, 40% of that land, now the remaining 60% is with you, gets a lot higher value because of the fact that now all this infrastructure has come up. So this model has seen a lot of success, and the most important aspect of making this a success is being transparent and being collective in this decision making. So they actually go to the farmer, the farmers negotiate with the aggregator, the government as a consortium. There is that conversation and discussions that happen, and then it reaches success. So I think that's one good model that I think there's a lot of learning for the rest of the country.
So which city in India you think has done a good job of what you just said? You said there are some good examples.
So Ahmedabad has done some good work around that. I think even Pune, if I'm not mistaken, there was a development on the west side towards Bangalore highway.
MRD.
Yeah. So I think there, I'd see again, a lot of this it's caste, and unfortunately it's hard to say this, but it's true. Like a lot of this it's easier to do when it's upper caste farmers who own big chunks of land, and then your negotiation becomes with a fewer number of people, and they are more aware of their rights and their privileges to have these conversations. It becomes a lot harder to do when you have smaller size of land, because then you'll have more farmers to get on board, and then there's a lot of playing one against the other and all of that happens. So we cannot say that these models are something that can be applied uniformly everywhere. There is going to be some places where you might have to do the just like taking over the land kind of a model, but I don't know. There are lots of places where you can potentially apply this.
I would actually link what you just said back to how you fell out of love with economics, because it's very easy to build a nice mathematical model that says that this is what will happen if you do it this way.
Yeah.
But the reality of the sociology in India is something that you can't capture in a mathematical model.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
it.
so I think the joys of urban planning that come to you is, I think, the only profession that is probably worse is geology. Because they say they say about geology, right? Nothing changes for a million years, and in some ways that is urban planning, because whatever whatever like joy you can get out of this work is you have to have a lot of patience for it, because a lot of things are you're talking about something that you will do today will get its benefit or see its impact like 30 or 40 years down the line, sometimes even longer. So yeah, you have to be very patient in this profession.
Okay. About 4 or 5 different questions that I'm dying to ask that have come from the students, but we'll come back to that in just a little while. Maybe a controversial question, maybe a deliberately controversial one, but I really am dying to ask this to a lot of people from within the field of urbanization. Does India actually need more slums? And by that I mean, are there aspects to living in a slum that we underrate? And second, related, what do we as a society not understand about slums?
But yeah, we don't understand a lot about slums, and a lot of recent studies have shown us that our whole idea of how slums work is greatly misleading, right? I think for one is that there's this entire parallel economy that happens in a lot of slums that get completely discounted or not counted at all. Forget about even being counted low, but not counted at all in our GDP calculations, in our different things that we do. So, I mean, there are many studies that show that Dharavi has a very thriving, I forget the rupee value of it, but it's a really thriving economy that is Dharavi with Dharavi, not necessarily Dharavi with the rest of the world. And it goes completely under the radar, so it doesn't enter GDP calculations, doesn't enter this. So we have very misconceived notions of what exactly are the dependencies in slums. Now, whether we need more slums or not, I mean, if we define slum as to be the kind of a place with very poor infrastructure and poor urban conditions, then obviously I would say we don't need more slums. But do we need more housing for the poor? Do we need more space for that? Absolutely. And I think slums arise as a consequence of the fact that we have not created the right kind of incentives for the market to provide these spaces. And I'm very careful about the way I've chosen these words, because many times people will say, okay, the solution for this is more government housing. And I do not necessarily think that is true. Because we see the problems which are there with government housing, right? And I think for those of you who would want to see the classic case is
Trying to resettle
if you
Dharavi.
take a road from, sorry?
Trying to resettle Dharavi is a classic example.
Yeah, exactly. So if you take your car and drive from Pune to Bombay, then you have to pass the Chembur road. Just before Chembur, there's this area, I think Govandi and Mankund, if I'm
Mankund, yeah.
not, yeah, where they have built these eyesore of these towers. Okay, they're like 14, 15-story towers, where literally one building is just a car distance away from the next building. So if you stretch your hand out a little bit and the guy from the other building stretches his hand out a little bit, we can actually shake hands. And so the people firstly who built these structures don't even understand how people are supposed to live, forget rich or poor, but secondly, they don't even understand poor people, because they have to recognize that poor people will, over time, if they want these facilities to be self-sustainable, they're not going to be able to sustain the infrastructure around a high rise, which is costly, because you require the water tanks, you require elevators, you require all of that thing to be maintained and well kept. And poor people are just not going to be able to afford that. That is why poor people prefer to live at the level of the street, because the infrastructure around that is a lot easier to maintain given the income resources that is there in their hands. Right. The second thing that we don't understand is that the jobs that are typically employed by low-income people, they need to have access to the jobs. So primarily, we choose residence based on the fact that it allows us access to employment. And if you put all of these people in another pocket and say, okay, now fine, you figure out about work, it's definitely not going to work out, right? So I think that is why I'm not in favor of government housing, but what I mean is there should be good government schemes to encourage the development of housing. So schemes such as earmarking a certain amount of land for low-income housing as part of your development scheme. So you ensure a bit of mixed land use around that, earmarking and certain amount of housing for disadvantaged. And we have now ways of identifying disadvantaged family groups. So you're marking certain amount of properties for only families that meet that eligibility criteria. These are the kind of things that we can do by, while still adopting the market principles. Without sacrificing market principles, we can still ensure that we cater for these needs as well.
Fair enough. Okay, I have about 5 questions that I want to ask you that are not really personal per se, but about your journey. Feel free to choose to not answer any one of them. Once we do those 5 questions, then we'll move on to some surprisingly and scarily excellent questions from the students.
Yeah.
So, first of all, if you got the chance to do your master's degree at Gokhale specifically, all over again, what would you do differently knowing what you do now?
I don't know. So I think a lot has changed since when I did my master's back then. As I said, it was a lot more academic. There was less avenues for exploring information outside our textbooks, and I think I'm glad that that is opening up a lot. One thing that I understood, and this is more by seeing students outside India. Now that I started working, I've been interacting a lot with younger people who are coming from universities outside India as well. I think one thing that I feel that I would have done differently is that I should have questioned more. And I would strongly encourage you all as students to actually question your professors a lot more. We in India tend to see that as being rude or being disrespectful if you start asking questions. And that is not how people outside India actually look at it. If you don't ask questions, they look at you as being somebody who lacks confidence or somebody who has not fully understood the problem. And again, the point that Ashish made in the beginning is actually important. Don't just ask questions for the sake of it, or don't ask questions where it's very easy to find the answer with the internet, but ask questions that show that you have an appreciation and understanding for what you for the topic, or ask questions that will genuinely clarify a doubt. So don't feel afraid about it from that perspective. The second thing is also to challenge ideas. I think we take a lot of things for granted in our education system. Okay, Adam Smith said this, Alfred Marshall said this, and blah 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 blah, and we are happy with that. But a lot of the education that I've seen from other places is about challenging ideas. It's about building your own perception and your own thought around these issues. I think that would be a nice thing. I wish I could have done that differently. I wish our professors would have let us do those things differently.
Absolutely.
Back in the day.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, my next question is along these lines. So it's one of those rare questions that I'm actually going to read out because what you just said right now really resonated with me. Is there a better way to learn than arguing with friends? And a related question, what would you recommend as useful tips when getting into an argument with friends? Because I honestly believe the reason I'm asking this question is I've learned a lot about urbanization quite literally by arguing with you. Sometimes heatedly, sometimes offline, whatever it may be. Yeah. But is there a better way to learn than argument? Number one. And number two, what tips would you recommend to students about arguing effectively?
No, I don't know about the tips because I actually think Ashish is very good in I would say arguing, but in putting out a point and explaining his point very well. And I feel sometimes I struggle with that. My basic thing, and this is something that I've learned and I try to do, though I don't always do it successfully, is that very often we try to pose problems that we don't have solutions for us, and then it becomes a question of like what you're saying, and you point problem in the other person's argument, and you can break down anyone's argument in that perspective, but do you have a solution for that argument, right? And I think there was this line that I saw in this movie, I can't remember which movie, but it's a line that has stayed with me. It's a line that says that you don't have a problem unless you have a solution, right? So nothing is a problem unless you have a solution. So come to me basically when you have some solution to a particular problem, and that is, I think, an important way to look at the world as such, is that when you have a different perspective on an idea, it's worth arguing about it. Otherwise, it's just about trying to break down the other person's perspective, and it gets you nowhere. Yeah, that's just my take on it. Yeah.
How has becoming a father changed your view about urbanization? So the reason I ask this question is because you know where I stay. We visited the place I stay at currently quite often. And until my
Yeah.
daughter was born, I had never once bothered about the fact that there were no footpaths leading up to my apartment.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
every time I go out with my daughter for a walk, it
Yeah.
strikes me
Yeah,
anxious.
I know what you're saying. So, I mean, okay, let me reveal a little bit more about myself. I mean, in many ways, my decision and my wife's decision together to leave India, which is a very hard decision, was actually taken because we now have a family, and we saw that India is changing in a good way, but that change is coming slowly, and a lot of times it's not happening in the way that we would have liked to see. And we thought whether we would it would be if we are given the opportunity to allow our children better infrastructure and better facilities, uh, should we not grab that opportunity with both hands? And obviously a decision that we struggled with. There's so much good for staying in India. There's so much good going for India that it was a hard decision to make. But I think had we been single and not having kids, it would have been a lot easier decision to make. But just having children and the fact that we can right outside our house, and we don't live in a very expensive area. We live in student housing on the university campus, but right outside our house there is this completely free. There are football grounds, hockey grounds, there's tennis courts, a swimming pool, there's a public forest. There's a forest that is like just a 2-minute walk from our house. So all of these facilities you slowly start valuing. I won't say more when you have children, but it definitely gives you a new appreciation of the importance of these things. And there's this nice line by an urbanist that says that if you make a good city for an 8-year-old child, then you make a good city for everybody, because uh, I mean, it's a line that in itself tells you what should be the goal for your city. Yeah, and yeah.
Fair enough. My final question before we reach the questions from students. Imagine, and this is of course in a post-COVID world where travel is possible. If a student has a luxury of spending, say, for example, a month traveling
Mm.
using second class train travel or whatever. So money
Mm.
isn't what I'm asking for or about. Which 3 or 4 cities in India do you think the student should definitely visit to get a sense of urbanization, good and bad?
Good and bad. Okay. No, I think you should definitely visit Chandigarh because it's often quoted as an example of what is good. And in many ways, it is got a lot of stuff that is good, but you can also go there to get an appreciation of where I think it could have been better. And I think we spoke about the fact of how it could be a more walkable city and a more dynamic city. And again, Chandigarh is also an example of a city that has pushed aside the market principles and being too controlled, which is why a lot of the market forces have not been able to be very kind with Chandigarh. So I think that's definitely a city that you would want to visit. And there's a lot of good to see in that city as well. I think cities of the south, there are some things that I really want to go and see the Kochi Metro. I've heard so many good things about it, and not just from the design but the way it operates. I think they've done a lot of good things around the Kochi Metro. I think that's fantastic. The Delhi Metro, I think, is also it's really commendable that in the span of what 20 odd years it has gone from nothing to I think now third or fourth largest metro in the world. I'm forgetting what it is, but it's really up there. And in terms of infrastructure, also I think it's top notch. That's another city that I really like visiting. Uh, there are good things to see in cities like Ahmedabad, Hyderabad, and Mumbai to some extent as well. But the thing with urban experiences in India is you have to go and pick the places to see the things to see. Because if I just say Ahmedabad is good, you'll say, oh, but there's so much of crap that is also there. And you're right. But I think there are certain things projects that I really admire. I know that this gets a lot of flack by urbanists like me, but the Sabarmati waterfront project, I think that's something nice to at least experience. Of course, there are things that are not quite right about that as well, but I like the fact that there was at least a focus towards creating public spaces along the main the main river in the city.
Mm.
So I think that's something that is nice to visit. But yeah, I think those are what my examples would be.
And what are thumb rules when you visit a city for the first time? What
Yeah,
should you keep in mind? So these days with Google Maps, it's become relatively easier. But
yeah.
what is your mental model for exploring a new city?
You walk through the city. I think you cannot get the feel of a city unless you walk through it. And I don't mean I walk through every part of it. Obviously, you take a week to get from one perspective, one place to the other. But when you get to a particular point, like if you want to experience Chandni Chowk, you walk through Chandni Chowk. If you want to experience basically the whole of Old Delhi, you walk through the Old Delhi. Then you get the real feel of what that place is. I think that is something to keep in mind. The second thing I think is looking beyond landmarks. I think we are a little tempted when we go to a new city is to do the tourist thing, right? Go and just check out the landmarks and experience that. But I think a lot of understanding the character of the city is around the areas that are not necessarily the tourist parts of the city, and you can get that understanding by actually talking to the locals or even googling that and seeing what is the real character and uh, thing about that city. And yeah, I would encourage, like if somebody is visiting Bandra in Mumbai, for example, the tendency would be to go to Bandstand or go see Shah Rukh Khan's house or all of those kind of thing. But I would, since I am from Bandra and Mumbai, I would say that the real experience of Bandra is actually walking through the villages of Bandra, through Ranwar and Varoda and all of these villages. Then you get the real feel of what that place used to be like. And I think that's what I would encourage people to do. Yeah.
Fair enough. All right. So, Binoy, personally, thank you so much because I'm done with my question. But if you have not strained your vocal cords enough, you can take some of the questions from the students.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So,
Let me see. Oh, you want to
yeah,
do
yeah,
that?
correct. I'll
Okay.
select a list. If possible, we'll go through all of them. But if not, then
Okay.
I'll pick the ones
Yeah.
that I find interesting. And this is me being selfish. So, Sahil
Yeah.
has a question, but don't answer it given your current circumstances in Vancouver.
Yeah.
But what does a typical day for a urban planning consultant look like?
Okay. So it's slow. I mean, I told you, right? It's like we compete with geologists in terms of fun. Things move extremely slowly, and it moves even slower in India. It can be extremely frustrating doing this kind of work. So if any of you are planning to get into that, I want to give you fair warning, right? It's a slow field, and there's a lot of politics and dirty politics around decision making that you have to learn to live with. Like you might have the best ideas, or somebody may have the best ideas, but they may not necessarily fly because they're not politically the right ways to go about things. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. Uh, my day-to-day work, and I know it's cliche to say this, but it's very true as an urban planner. No 2 days are alike. Every day we're doing something different. Uh, a lot of our work is analytical, but a lot of our work is actually people engagement and what would you call stakeholder buy-in. Okay, so and especially as you get more senior in that field, you spend less amount of time over technical drawings and technical design, but you spend more amount of time actually trying to sell your ideas and get people on board and get people together. So as I sort of started advancing in my career in urban planning in India, uh, I almost like initially I would spend a lot of time on AutoCAD and Excel because I would be doing the analytical and the fun design modeling work and all of that myself. But sometime recently I looked back and I realized that my AutoCAD license had on my laptop had expired, and I didn't even know that because I had not even opened it for like 2 years, because now the younger people are actually the ones who do that. And my work is more about just presenting ideas and presenting thoughts. So I think that's something that uh, is there that goes with the territory, and you have to recognize that when getting into a career in urban planning.
It lasted about 90 minutes without bringing up COVID, which has got to be some
Yeah. Yeah.
statement. But
Oh wait, what is that? Must be something new.
so
Yeah.
it had to come up sooner or later. So Vedan has a question about how challenging it is going to be to get people to feel safe using public transport post-COVID. So
Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to be crude, but I'm telling you, people in my profession right now are literally shitting bricks about this, because everything about COVID the principles, not principles, whatever, the recommendations to keep COVID at bay are the ones that go against what we've been saying for the longest time. So we talk about the importance of crowding and high density and transit, like having getting more people on transit and all of that, and that's all bad for COVID, right? I mean, bad in the sense that it helps spread COVID. So we are just hoping that this is a bubble that the world will get over soon, and that COVID is not here to stay in the long term. And we don't have too many precedents in terms of data points. The only data point for this was 100 years back with the Spanish flu, right? But even going by that data point, it lasted, I think, 3 years. A lot of people died, and it was a terrible situation. But once humanity went through that cycle, it sort of corrected itself, and that no more became an issue. So right now, we feel that it's too early to react long term to change the way we're thinking about the importance of things around high density neighborhoods and promoting public transit. We may be wrong, and we may have to, and COVID might actually be the new normal, as people say, and we might have to rethink the way things are planned. But for now, my personal feeling is to just wait it out. I know 3 years is a long time to wait it out, but I don't necessarily see people changing the way they promote things around transit, density, and all of that. There are the stopgap arrangements around mask wearing and all of that, which is, so right now it's mandatory. I'm sure it is the case in India as well, but it's mandatory on all transit vehicles. You have to wear a mask. But yeah, I hope that long term we don't have to do that. Yeah.
Fair enough. So another question by Anshi was, in a sense, already answered by you. So I'll keep skipping backwards and forwards the list of questions.
Sure.
The next question that I'm going to ask is from Varada, and this is probably going to raise your blood pressure, but your thoughts on flyovers everywhere and their utility.
Yeah, and I think this is a point that even Ashish and I touched on our podcast, is that I mean, so I've been working with WRI has actually given me the luxury of visiting a lot of cities across the world, and I'm telling you, outside South Asia, you almost don't see flyovers anywhere in the world, and definitely not in the Western world, in North America or Europe or Canada. Now, I want to make sure that I distinguish between a flyover and a elevated freeway. Okay, now, so the closest example of an elevated freeway is the one that they built in Mumbai along the eastern freeway. Basically, that connects, I think, Badala all the way down to South Bombay.
Yeah.
So I'm distinguishing those because those are long elevated roads versus the flyover. Flyovers just meant to climb one intersection and cross over. Now, those flyovers that just cross one intersection and cross over, I've almost not seen them anywhere in North America or Europe. Why? Is because one is they extremely ugly, right? And they completely destroy the urban fabric of your city. The second thing is they don't really solve any problem, because all you're doing is you're making life easier that one intersection, but pushing the problem down to the next intersection. So what are you effectively going to get is a kind of a up and down of traffic till you eventually come to a point where they'll be stuck in jam. And you can see that in Mumbai on the Western Express Highway, where you have flyover after flyover, you finally get a jam at the point where there is no flyover, right? Because at some point you have to stop doing the flyover, right? Because there is no space available. The other problem that I have with flyovers is very often it solves the wrong kind of problem, because you create a new problem under the flyover. And this, if you ever, and again, I'm sorry to use Mumbai again as an example because it's most familiar to me, but there is this Tulsi Pipe Road around where the Phoenix Mall is, right? And they have built this flyover right outside that. But the flyover is meant to cross that particular area where the mills are. But most of the traffic is going to the mills, so they all have to go under the flyover. So and what you have left under the flyover now is just one lane. And
Right.
so as a result, you have a much higher buildup of traffic under the flyover than is there above the flyover. And that actually is bad, right? Because had you not had the flyover, you would have had a much wider road width to better manage the traffic movement and circulation along that road. So I strongly, I mean, I think that the worst thing that could have happened to Mumbai was those 5 years when Nitin Gadkari was the transport minister of Maharashtra and went berserk with these flyovers all over Mumbai. And unfortunately, that's a paradigm that a lot of cities in India seem to take as it's kind of the symbol of development, a flyover, but it's a worst thing that can potentially happen. And I don't, so there are flyovers that cross railway tracks, and then obviously they're necessary because that's the only way you get across. So they're more like bridges, but flyovers that are just crossing an intersection, more often than not, they're a terrible idea.
Fair enough. Gandhar has an interesting question, and the reason it's interesting is because one of the most fascinating things I read this year, when I say this year, I mean in 2020, was Haussmann's attempt to restructure not just the buildings, but also the look and feel of Paris. Apparently, did not go down well when he was restructuring it,
Mm-hmm.
which is to me interesting because the Paris that I know and love today apparently was very different from about, say, 120 years ago. And people back then didn't want that look of Paris to emerge.
Yeah.
Just
I
very fascinating. But the question that Gandhar has is it possible to do something like that for Pune while maintaining its cultural integrity?
So this is I mean, it's a very, very good question. And I think a bit of backstory, I don't know if many of you know this, that the Eiffel Tower in Paris was initially planned to be up for, I think, only a year or so because they were doing some World Expo and then it was supposed to be brought down.
Right.
And when they had plans for the Eiffel Tower, it was extremely criticized at that point of time. All the urbanists, this is a horrid thing. It doesn't fit in with Paris. But now, can you imagine Paris without the Eiffel Tower? It's like hard to think so, right? So sometimes we don't, and all of us at the end of the day, we're human, right? We don't necessarily have the foresight to think of what can become iconic and what can actually change a character in a good way and what can be something that is terrible. Right? And I think there are some examples of terrible stuff that should be brought down as well. But having said that, I think we have to take each thing on a case by case basis. And if you do this in the right way, it's okay for cities to slowly recognize each era that they're passing through, right? So just because Pune is an old city doesn't mean that it should not get new buildings and have a new character. But at the same time, certain buildings and certain iconic structures from the past should be maintained and maintained like they were back then. But new buildings that come up can reflect the character and the age and the technology that we are currently in. And then you get these different layers of development, which actually look nice. Sometimes they look good together. Sometimes they clash and conflict with each other. But by and large, I think there is the whole notion around cultural integrity is very touchy because it's all about balance. There are places when you need to be very sanctimonious about it and say, no, we should fight this change and fight it. But in certain places, especially around the expansions of a city, I think it's okay to embrace what is new, because someday they'll be old and your grandchildren will be fighting to keep it the way it was. Yeah.
Fair enough. Ananya has a question about whether a city like Pune really needs a metro. Couldn't we just do with what we have, or at least improve what we have before building the metro?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'll answer it in two ways. Yes, Pune needs a metro, but the second part of what you said is, does it need to do a lot of things before it gets to a metro? Absolutely, yes. And that is unfortunately the story about metro in India. Metro for us has now become this thing that we see. Oh wow, look at it! It's something so wonderful. Let's invest in a metro, and metros are extremely expensive. So a lot of cities that can be doing a lot more with buses don't end up doing that because they invested all their resources in metro. Now, why I say Pune would probably need a metro, because Pune is a 5 million plus city, and I think at that scale, it probably needs a high density corridor or so. But something like a Lucknow, now Lucknow has a metro, Jaipur has a metro. All these other smaller cities are planning metros. When they could have used the same amount of money that they have invested on a metro corridor, and instead of doing just one corridor, they could have had 10 high capacity bus transit corridor. And I don't mean BRT. And again, I'm telling you, the thing about BRT is it's really been terribly applied in a lot of Indian cities, that it's given BRT such a bad name that I think it's better to not do BRT in India, just because now anybody puts up a guardrail and has a bus running through it and they call it a BRT, and that is not what a BRT at the end of the day is. is a technology-driven system with physical infrastructure just being one component of it. We in India have done physical infrastructure like in Pune without the technology component, and then it fails. It just becomes something that, yeah, I mean, it marginally makes bus travel better, but it at a big cost that is just not worth it.
And two last questions. One, Madhura asks, what are your thoughts on Auroville?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a negative thought about it. I mean, it's again about scale. I mean, it's a nice way to live if you're going to be living at that scale. But at the end of the day, I think this all comes down to choices. You need to have cities like Mumbai. You need to have settlements like Auroville. You need things at different scale. And at the end of the day, it's all about that. I guess. I mean, I don't have any thought beyond that. I've not heard anything negative about it. It's not a place that I would like to live in personally, but yeah, I think it's. I don't know.
And the last question for this particular talk, at least, well, two. They just asked one, but we'll stop with Adya's question. So Anshi's question is about smart cities, and especially those that are not in touch with the original city. Her example is Naya Raipur and Raipur. There are Hajar examples from all over the world. We've spoken about this in the podcast, but if you wouldn't mind speaking about it briefly.
Okay. So again, smart city like BRT. So 10 years back, BRT was the buzzword for all Indian planners, and there would be conferences after conference on BRT and BRT. That has slowly moved into, so in between there was bike sharing because China was investing a lot in bike sharing, and that sort of flavor of the month sort of went very quickly, and now it's smart city. And this is again, it's a buzzword driven with nobody having any common definition of what constitutes a smart city. The government of India runs a smart city program, which I'm sorry to say this is just a rewording of the JNNURM scheme without the Jawaharlal Nehru part of the name, because for obvious reason they want to drop that. Because at the end of the day, what it is basically, it's central money given to cities to do something better with for the people, and they with the flavor of an outside element of technology applied to it. But essentially, what is a smart city or what is a smart anything? It's basically making intelligent decisions with the resources that you have. Does it necessarily need to be a technology-driven city? I don't know, because some way that when the term smart city was introduced, that was how it was defined. But that's not the way the government of India is using the smart city concept. Talking about Naya Raipur and Raipur city, and I think the larger question is, did Chhattisgarh need a Naya Raipur? Could they have not just made a better capital around the Raipur city? What was the need to create that additional thing? And it comes down to real estate, land grabbing, this whole political concept that we need these greenfield cities. The same thing is what Andhra Pradesh tried with Amravati, and that has fallen through. So the thing is, I'm not in favor of it. All of this, see, all of them have their origin in Chandigarh. So whether it's Gandhinagar, Bhubaneswar, Naya Raipur, all of them, not only they follow the urban form of Chandigarh, but it's also the same vision that a capital needs to be separate from the masses, and Raipur is too dirty and old a city, so we need to create a Naya Raipur and a new, on a clean slate. And I don't necessarily think that's the right way to go. Yes, I do support the need to create new towns and new settlements, but I feel that they need to be spurred organically around an existing entity and not just something blank sitting on a clean slate. And that's why Raipur today Naya Raipur is dead. There are many problems with its urban form, especially. If I'm not mistaken, they have right-of-ways of 100 meters. So basically, you have to be Usain Bolt to cross that street. Okay, so the road width 100 meters in their central avenue leading up to the Capitol complex. So I don't know. I don't think it was a well thought out or a well planned city, which is why it's probably failing and will continue to fail.
All right. And last question for the day. Adya asks if Mumbai is overdoing the metros.
I don't think so. I think Mumbai joined the metro party a little late now, and I mean, if I had to be a little picky, I would criticize some of the choice of corridors because they are running very close or very parallel to the existing suburban railway system. So I would say in that sense, yeah, I would agree with you. But as far as the east-west connectors, I'm a big supporter of having them because the suburban railway systems do not have the east-west connectors. So I think it's good that Mumbai is developing them. So yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't say that Mumbai is really overdoing the metro. I think it started late, uh, and yeah, it's just trying to play catch up in a way. It's good that they're doing all of them simultaneously. Let the city go through a little pain for a few years, and hopefully we'll get this system good at one time. But one thing I think that we had, since we brought up the thing about metros, I think again here we see it as only the transit infrastructure, right? But what happens around the infrastructure, that is the access to these stations and the development around these stations, I think that's a big part that we've completely lost with the first metro corridor, right? So if you have to go to any of these stations on the Mumbai Metro, they have very poor access. You come down on from a wonderful world-class metro station, and you come down at the street level, and it's complete chaos. You don't even have enough width on the sidewalk to accommodate the capacity of the people coming out of the metro station, or leave alone facilities for transfer to a rickshaw or a taxi or a bus or whatever have you. So that is something that I think we need to do well. So if your question is, are we doing metros too fast and not catering to the surrounding infrastructure that comes with a metro corridor? Absolutely agree with you. We need to take these things simultaneously. And if we can't handle it simultaneously, then we should probably be stretching out the metro implementation with this. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Good. Binoy, thank you
Good.
so much for your time.
Thanks. It was wonderful. Yeah. And hope I could answer all your questions. I was really fascinated and impressed by the knowledge of a lot of these students, and actually put me to shame with some of the concepts that even I did not know about. So I'm a little embarrassed, but I'm also happy to learn about them. I'm going to go back now and look for YouTube videos for some of these concepts that you talked about.
Awesome.
And yeah, happy to interact with all of you.